Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV. Is the FCC ordering your internet provider to give you a speed increase? You might have gotten that impression from some of the headlines that came out last week following a study that the FCC did to define what broadband is from a regulatory perspective. But the reality, of course, is that it's a lot more complicated, and no, the FCC is likely not going to increase your internet speeds anytime soon. Let's get to it. Now, the speed increase came as the result of a regular assessment that the FCC is supposed to do in regards to the broadband rollout across the United States. This was part of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. We'll take a look at the language of that act in a minute because it's important here. And they were supposed to do this on a regular basis. The FCC calls this an annual assessment, but they haven't adopted an assessment since 2015. And this is partly because there's been a party deadlock on the commission up until recently. They had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and there's been a lot of discussion about how far the FCC's regulatory powers should go in regards to internet versus the older technologies like telephone and cable TV. And so that kind of held up this report. But now that there's 3 Democrats on the commission, they were able to adopt this with the 2 Republicans dissenting. And I'll talk about why they dissented in a minute. Now, in 2015, the FCC described broadband as 20 megabits down and 3 megabits up. And of course, that was before the pandemic and everybody working remotely. And of course, upload speeds are a lot more important. So now the commission is working off of this definition, which is now adopted as part of this report, in which broadband is defined as 100 megabits down and 20 megabits up, a pretty substantial bump in speed. What's interesting is that in some parts of where I live here, where Comcast is still the only provider, they only recently got up to that 20 megabit speed. But at the end of the day, these definitions don't mean much of anything because these services are largely not regulated. So if they're maybe getting federal dollars to provide broadband to an underserved region, they'd have to meet these requirements. But as far as what they offer to consumers in a general market, there is no regulation. So this is mostly just a definition and not a rule. Now, as I mentioned, these bandwidth goals were set as part of an assessment. And of course, that assessment is looking at the rollout of broadband here in the United States. The FCC has been tracking this since 1996 when Congress passed that law and set a goal to get every American hooked up to broadband internet connections. And unfortunately, at least if you look at the report on the surface, it looks like we're still not there despite billions of dollars spent. Now, they break this report out into a couple of bullet points. The first one is that 24 million Americans lack access to some kind of fixed terrestrial broadband service. This means internet being delivered with some kind of cable, whether it's fiber optic or coax. So that's a big number, but that number excludes satellite service, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. They also have a standard for mobile internet, and there they say you should get a download speed of 35 megabits per second and 3 megabits up to achieve the goal of being a mobile broadband provider. That one's looking a little better because there, only about 9% of Americans live in an area that's not near a physically deployed tower that can meet those speeds. However, most of them are likely in the same place where they can't get a physical terrestrial internet connection either. So that's a big issue here. But mobile does look a little bit better. However, 45 million Americans lack access to both the 100 down, 20 up standard and the 35 down, 3 up mobile standard. And as I mentioned earlier, in my area, only recently did Comcast get their base level of service up to that level. So that's something to keep an eye on here, that's a big number that doesn't meet this new minimum standard. Now, these companies don't have to provide it, as I mentioned, but from a PR perspective, they may want to consider it because if they're going to be selling broadband, they should at least meet what the federal standard is. And although there's no regulation about it, they could get sued for false advertising if they call their service broadband and they're not meeting the federal standard for it. So there's always a way to litigate when things are not regulated. Now, they also set a standard for schools in this report. And remember, many schools are getting federally subsidized internet services. So I would imagine the providers on the receiving end of those funds may have to look at upping the bandwidth in many schools across the U.S. And according to the report, U.S. schools got a C at 74%, meeting the goal across the country. That's actually better than I expected, but still a lot of room to go here. Additionally, they set a longer-term goal for the broadband definition to eventually mean 1 gigabit per second down and 500 megabits per second up. Now remember, all of these numbers here insofar as meeting standards do not include satellite service, and that was a big part of the dissenting opinion that was issued by the two Republican members of the FCC. I'm going to focus in on this one from Brendan Carr, who provided a lot more information than his Republican colleague did as to why he was opposing it. Now, one note here is that Brendan Carr is very much against any kind of regulation of internet providers. He feels that the market should allow for things to kind of flesh themselves out on their own. And he was very upset that they excluded Starlink from their assessment, because if you include Starlink insofar as availability is concerned, what you will find is that a good chunk of the country now, including many of the areas that are not well served by physical broadband, are now accessible. Now, Carr makes a good point here, because the Telecommunications Act of 1996 is a very broad definition of what broadband is. Now, in the law, they call it an advanced telecommunications capability, and it says the definition of that capability is without regard to any transmission media or technology. In other words, whatever meets the standard counts. And right now, the FCC is essentially ignoring what Starlink can bring to many of these rural areas, and already does. So the number of people now without access to that level of connection is much smaller than the report might indicate. Now, why does that matter? Well, the reason it matters is for another section of the law here that Carr points out in his rebuttal. He says he believes that doling out a failing grade will give the agency more power. I don't think it's too surprising that the commission landed where it did. And if you look at the law, it actually says that if the commission's determination is negative, it shall take immediate action to accelerate deployment of such capability by removing barriers to infrastructure investment and by promoting competition in the telecommunications market. Now, Carr's concern here is that the FCC, through this negative report, is laying the foundation for applying more aggressive regulations to internet service providers. And if you take a look at some of the actions they took in October, they are definitely moving in that direction with a 3-2 party line vote to open the docket, to basically start investigating once again whether or not internet service providers should be treated the same as an old telephone company would. And if you want more information on Title II and how extensive these regulations are, there's a great report here from the Congressional Research Service that gives you some background on the law and how it evolved and all the things that it covers. And certainly this would put the internet service providers throughout the country under much more strict regulation on everything from net neutrality all the way to what they charge their customers. Now, in my area, our local phone company still operates a Title II regulated copper phone line network around the region, but they're also now rolling out a broadband fiber product. And when you switch to the fiber, they sever your copper line to move you away from that regulated product to an unregulated one. But in my region, we have a lot of competition now. So we have Frontier, we have Comcast, we have another smaller ISP, GoNetspeed, that we visited recently that's slowly growing in this area as well. We've got wireless providers like Verizon offering service, and of course Starlink is available to me here as well. It's crazy that I went from having no choice to a lot of choices in a short period of time. And I would argue that perhaps in regions like mine, where you do have a lot of consumer choice, heavy regulation may not be as necessary as it might be in an area where you only have one choice. And I know in Connecticut here, at least with the cable companies, they put cable companies in a very high state of regulation if there was no competition. But once our local phone company, about 20 or so years ago, started offering cable service, they rolled those regulations back because now consumers had more choice. So I think whatever the FCC should do here should be looking at the competitive landscape locally to figure out what makes the most sense. But we'll have to see how this all pans out. It was also interesting to see, as I was going through Section 706 of the law, to see that price cap regulation is something that is in the law that apparently the FCC could do with broadband providers without having to put them into a Title II situation. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how this would translate, but I would imagine they may have a little bit of control over how pricing works out, especially in areas where there's not a lot of consumer choice. Now, one other thing to note on the Starlink side is that not only does the FCC not count Starlink for just overall broadband reach, they also did not allow them to participate in getting a subsidy for providing service to those areas, because Starlink is a lot more expensive than your traditional internet service might be. I think it's about $100 a month plus the cost of the dish. This might have helped those regions be able to achieve the government's goals more quickly without having to make the infrastructure investment. But the FCC, I think, really looks at satellite differently. It could very well be some anti-Elon Musk stuff in here, but I've seen in other areas, especially when we've been looking at some local cable access TV issues in my area, satellite is always excluded for some reason. And I think what they should be looking at now is seeing satellite as just another mechanism of delivery as opposed to something different. So there you go. This goes well beyond just looking at how fast your internet should be. This is just one component of a pretty big battle ahead within the FCC, but also likely within Congress and the judicial system in the months ahead here. So it'll be fun to watch, and I'll keep you updated as to what happens next. Until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Brian Parker, Budley, Hot Sauce and Video Games, Steve Green, and Amda Brown. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.